Welcome to Mona Tutorials. In this session, we will be looking at an overview of creating modular assets using trim sheets. We will look at creating the trim sheet texture before going over making some assets in Blender and then putting it together as an asset in Unity for testing. Let's jump in. A common approach to asset creation is creating modular assets. Modular assets are more like parts of assets that you combine into larger assets. A simple example is creating separate parts as walls, doors, windows, roof parts, and so on, so that you can make many different buildings with very few parts. As each building is made with fewer assets, the overall file size is significantly smaller, meaning it takes less time to download or offers more room for other assets or textures. If you manage to reduce the material count for the parts as well, you can have unique buildings with reduced draw calls, which allow for better experiences overall with a higher frame rate. A great approach to getting the draw calls down is using trim sheets. We have a tutorial on this linked below. This tutorial is more an overview of this method of trim sheet creation and creating modular assets with it. In this example, I started making the trim sheet texture first. Alternatively, you may want to start on the 3D assets to get an idea of the textures you need, and then create the trim sheet after that. Both have pros and cons, and in some cases it might be a mix of the two. I'm going with a 3D asset bake approach, as I'd like to lean in towards a more stylized texture. If you wanted a more realistic approach, you could use CC0 textures from the site like Ambient CG, and piece together different textures, or jump into a program like Substance Painter and make them manually in there. There are always a range of options to every step of the process. These are just the most common approaches that I like to use. Note how some areas of the textures end up reaching from side to side, and others are simple areas on the texture. This is covered more in depth in the trim sheet tutorial linked below, but the ones that reach from side to side are used so that they can tile the texture and have the UVs of the polygons stretch over the end without issue. If the texture is tiled correctly, then the texture will continue to flow correctly. This is great for things like floorboards or tiled rock, for use on floors or walls. It is possible to use parts of these tileable texture areas as single assets as well. A good approach to tile sheets is understanding that any part of the texture can be used for anything, and some of the best results will come from experimenting with your asset or UVs in creative ways. Before wrapping up, I decided that instead of floorboards, I'd prefer a rock tile section. This would allow for more interesting wall and decoration assets. Now that I have a trim sheet layout created with assets in Blender, I take this into ZBrush to add detail. This could be done to a point with Substance Painter as well, but as noted, I'm going for a more stylized approach, and I find this is good to do manually with sculpting. Blender has more than reasonable sculpting tools as well, but as I am more comfortable with ZBrush, I use that one. I'd most likely spend a lot more time working on this for the best results, but figure you'd get the idea with the speedrun. It's a good point to note that it's always a good idea to find reference material to improve your assets alongside your current skills. Reference could be types of assets that you want to create, to style approaches applied to new assets. So you might want to get Arcane or Into the Spider-Verse style images next to images of Unity Store modular assets with some Mid-Journey or Stable Diffusion images on the side. Mashing them all together to create the perfect modular assets for your purposes is the goal. The trick is getting the model to look good and be optimized, and for this a good tactic is to check out ArtStation for Marmoset assets or Sketchfab so you can turn on the wireframe and see how they've done it. This also allows you to look around the asset from all angles. The next stage is taking the high poly assets into Substance Painter to bake them onto a simple polygon square that results in the texture to be used on our final assets. I can then add some color and add texture using Painter's materials to bring some life to the end result. All of this is in order to make the texture, or the material. This has nothing to do with the modular assets that I create with this trim sheet texture in mind. In this example, I didn't make the tileable texture at the top or the plain wall texture tile. The wall is less important in this case, as I have a workaround with creating assets like pillars or panels that hide the lack of tiling, but I would most likely look at tiling this texture in Photoshop due to how I created it. The trick there is you'd have to line up both the diffuse map and the normal map to tile, so it is better, if possible, to create the 3D assets to tile in the first place. It might come down to a mix of both approaches, or something else that I haven't even considered. With the texture complete and exported, I can set it up as a material in Blender to start building my modular assets. If I'm building an asset to use in Unity, I wouldn't worry about setting up the material correctly in Blender, as I will be making the material in Unity with its settings. If I am exporting a GLB, however, I would need to spend the time to set up the textures and materials correctly in Blender. The assets that I'm creating with this trim sheet are relatively simple and low polygon, which is great, as you would probably use a lot of these to create an asset in Mona. As with all WebGL assets, the poly count, material count, and texture size are all very important elements to reduce. So making sure that I remove any polygons that are not seen, and that every polygon has a reason to be there is part of the fun. At least, maybe that's just me. Note how I'm actually adding polygons to the roofing in order to allow for that part of the texture to be used over and over. This is where the magic of trim sheets comes in. I'm not adding that many polygons all up, but I'm using a significantly smaller area of the texture. Finding the balance between poly count and texture size is where a large part of the skill in using trim sheets comes from, but also allows for some creative applications, such as flattening the UVs horizontally to have the texture flow down at the front and side of the roof tile. Trim sheets are probably the main approach to making assets where the UVs are as much a part of the creation process as anything else. Sometimes you will create the minimum polygons for the asset, and other times you will add polygons to utilize the texture better. And sometimes you'll make a mistake and find that it works even better as you are moving UVs around a texture. It's kind of amazing what results you can get with a bit of creativity. Moving on to a door, you will note that the door is quite a large size, but we don't have much wood texture to use in the texture. But as with the rooftop section, we can utilize that one area of wood to cover the entire door by adding a little detail with the polygons. Taking this a little further, you can use Blender's crease tools to allow for smooth and sharp edges after smoothing the asset. I also use the face orientation overlay to make sure that the polygon facing direction, or normals, are facing the right way. Blue is what you see in Mona, red would be invisible. If you scale anything to a negative, it will flip the normals for you. These are easy to flip back in the Edit mode, Mesh, Normals menu. With some first assets created, I'm going to take them into Unity to see what they look like in Mona space. In this case, I'm using FBX and creating the material in Unity directly. But as noted, you could also create a GLB if you are making standalone assets with the material set up correctly in the 3D creation tool like Blender. If you want to test your GLBs in a Mona space, however, you will need to use a package to import the GLB, as this is not compatible natively in Unity. Two options for this include the Unity GLT Fast package or the UniVRM package. Both tools are covered in the documentation linked below. You'll see that I use a pillar to hide the lack of tiling on the wall, and jump back into Blender to make some tweaks to the assets as I go. As you can see, setting up the space is super quick, as I've made all the assets accurate lengths to the default snapping length in Unity. The snapping length is 0.25 meters by default, so it's highly recommended to make your asset as a derivative of 0.25. As these walls are 3 by 3 meters, it's very easy to line them up. Note how the pivot of the asset is very useful in modifying my assets in the space. The pivot is not at the very end of the wall, it is at the base in the center of the pillar. This allows me to easily rotate the wall and continue along without any issue. It is possible to add the pivot to the center of the asset, but as Unity has a center pivot location setting as well as the pivot you set, you can give more options for creating the result. I also modify a couple of the assets slightly, such as the middle pillar, if the stretching of the texture isn't too obvious. You can of course utilize this approach as well in many different ways. So creating modular assets and using trim sheets in creative ways is a fantastic way to create a considerable number of results in game spaces with very low resources in polygon and material count, as well as texture size. I end up making a considerable number of more assets, and the FBX comes to a total of 158k. Both the 1024 diffuse and normal textures come to a total of 1.8 meg. Now adding all these assets together into Unity and duplicating them does create a small amount more, but the main cost is the original assets. So this is very small for what the results can give you. In this tutorial, we did a time-lapse and overview of creating modular assets using a trim sheet approach. There are many other approaches to creating low-resource assets as well, such as palette texturing or texture atlasing, which we cover more in depth in the docs below. Thanks for watching, and happy building!